Palm Predators. Palm Predators. It was a late 2010 smartphone-driven fad. Just download it from the App Store. It's fun for the whole family. It started to die off in 2018, but it was a relatively pandemic-safe, mostly outside activity for kids and adults alike. And it caught a second wind. It's really simple. The app created an augmented reality interface with your smartphone's GPS and helped you track down mythical creatures like unicorns and leprechauns, as well as horrific monsters like werewolves and skinwalkers, some hiding in plain sight, and sometimes they were far off the beaten path. After subduing and capturing these creatures in the wild, the more placid creatures would be used to spawn power-ups that you could farm, while the most terrifying monsters enabled players to fight with them against other players' monsters to rank them up, gain new abilities, and thus have a better chance of capturing even stronger, wilder creatures. Unguarded unicorns, or creatures of the like, on the other hand, were easy prey for opponents' monsters, and permitted opponents to steal their power-ups rather than go to their owners. The interface is simple, and it's highly thematic depending on which type of monster you're currently hunting or fighting with. The depictions of the creatures and the depictions of combat are dynamic and were vivid, while the backstories and lore behind the creatures, whether common and descended from folklore or rare and imagined, were all compelling. It was a straight-up addicting game and puts games like Fortnite and Candy Crush to shame. It's the perfect thing to do while your mom barricades herself in her office to work from home and you're stuck taking care of your 7-year-old brother and 10-year-old sister while you're supposed to be remote learning. It was the only thing that made those first few months of being stuck at home, stuck inside and stuck apart, tolerable. But as summer rolled around, things started to get a little weirder. The game, unlike virtually all other free-to-play games, did not have a store where you could pay real money to skip the line and acquire upgrades, new monsters, or customized items. Instead, everything was a true scavenger hunt, released in dribbles, but sometimes in downpours, called events. These events were highly publicized on the app, with countdowns to the day that they would start, as well as the types of awards that were possible during the event. The events came regularly at first, and the challenges associated with the rare and valuable loot or creatures weren't very challenging at all. By late June, though, the events were seemingly randomized in time duration, and even directed at certain geographical areas. By July, the events were highly personalized. I'll never forget waking up to the spectral image of my little sister Grace standing in front of my closet, frontlit by the smartphone screen, trying to get the closet monster, an amorphous black ghoul with demonic red eyes. Its stats as a ghost-type monster are highly sought after, hence why Grace felt compelled to sneak into my room in the middle of the night and fight the creature at the threshold of its realm. Worse than that, Christopher, my little brother, didn't think twice about diving headlong into a patch of poison ivy to pursue a level 16 Titan Toad, a massive, muscular brown and yellow amphibian with both melee combat potential and dual-use poison sacs, which can dish out damage or provide helpful components to potions. Needless to say, he spent the next 2 weeks soaking in oatmeal bath bogs and drenched in calamine lotion. Hardly the best of states to be showing off your hard-won critter. The dog days of summer wore on, and after several weeks of painfully dull routines, the app announced the big one. This was the big one, and in a brief 20-second short video, the app insinuated your most coveted creature, ability, or power-up could become yours that day. I discovered that perhaps each video was unique to each specific player, as players, young and old alike, published their own reaction videos to YouTube. There was even a fan analysis indicating the video may have been tailored to each player by frequency of search results of abilities and creatures on the app, and maybe even voice extractions picked up by the phone and app itself. In short, it was listening to you, it was watching you, and it knew what you wanted. the most. I was concerned at this point about when the event would start and how difficult the items would be to find. I was also concerned about the seemingly universal offer of 5 times combat experience points for PvP, player versus player encounters. Most of the events, as I mentioned before, had countdown timers to the start of the event, and then another timer measuring the duration of the event. In this case, the big one had none of these, only a date of August 5th, 2020. I had a feeling already that I wouldn't be able to seek out what I wanted, because I knew I would have to look after Grace and Chris. I remember when the big one was only 2 or 3 days away and I wanted to talk to Grace and Chris about the event. I didn't want them to wander off too far when the event started for them. And no matter what, they shouldn't try to spend too much time around other people trying to go after the same things. I told them this, but I could tell they weren't listening to me. They were too busy playing the pre-event modifier tasks, which apparently, in this particular event, extended their ability to gain new items. For instance, the longer that they played these pre-events, the more time they would get to actually gather the things that they wanted. The more effort they put into the pre-event, the more likely they'd be able to get what they wanted out of the big one. One more video came out just before the event. This time, it was the same for everyone, and the tagline was, "This is for all the marbles." Grace and Chris had been out too long, in too much sun, up too late, past their bedtimes, and their eyes too crossed from all the screen time. But I never saw either of them more excited for anything that wasn't their birthday or Christmas morning. The day of the big one finally came, and since I was their caretaker and had the car, Mom ordered me to take my little brother and little sister wherever their palm predators appeared that day, before she shoved a big piece of toast into her mouth and retreated to her work-from-home office. A few juice boxes and baggies of snacks later, I was being directed to the local nature preserve, which the city tried to maintain as a public works buffer between the homes and the dilapidated eyesore icons of our little piece of the Rust Belt. Christopher insisted on riding up front so he could get one last extra bit of charge on his phone, while Grace sat directly behind me and kicked the back of my seat and insisted that I go faster to the park. She wasn't the only one, as I felt like I was being tailgated the entire way and saw at least one person blow through a red light. Normally I wouldn't think that these were related to each other, but then we got to the park, which was the most crowded I'd ever seen it at 9 a.m. in the morning, during a pandemic nonetheless. I got out of the van and strode a few feet away into the grassy field next to the parking lot. There was a tense atmosphere of eager couples and flocks of children running from one end of the picnic area to the other, chasing things on their phones while others trotted into the wilderness trails. The frenzy of gritted teeth and sweat made whole fury of action seem more like a virtual slaughterhouse in action than something fun. I calmed myself and resigned myself to not to play, as I was worried for Chris and Grace in this place lacking in any kind of adult self-control. This was made worse when a woman in a bright yellow sundress stepped in front of me and mumbled something through her sunflower mask. It was an angry grunting noise that sounds more like an angry customer garbled through the drive-through microphone than someone trying to have fun. I lifted my hands defensively and stepped away as she pulled her mask down and repeated a feverish demand to fight her level 15 Zomflower. Her eyes were wide and unblinking like ball bearings, and as a small crowd seemed to socially undistance around us, I felt compelled to play. I didn't think she would take no for an answer. I pulled up my phone, the app, and my weakest monster. I wanted this to be over quickly. She told me that she didn't want to fight my level 1 Arachna Eagle, but rather my top-of-the-line level 13 Shark Tortoise. I agreed with the request, but I was still anxious to throw the match, so I chose none of my secret potions or power-ups. That didn't satisfy her. She reached out and knocked the smartphone from my hand the moment the match started, and then with a series of swift clicks and finger drags defeated my Shark Tortoise. That was quite a bit of 5 times combat experience for her. And this shit was driving people mad. Mad enough to forget about the pandemic, mad enough to forget to be an adult, mad enough to forget their kids. I remember telling myself as I picked up my phone out of the short grass, brushed off the screen, and removed myself from the digital arena assembling around me. I tried to brush it off, all of it. I turned towards the picnic tables where some children were roaming, then back towards the swing set. I started to panic as Chris and Grace were nowhere to be found. As I raced down the nearest trail, I consulted the app. I had Chris's most favorite creature on my most recent search because he was constantly talking about it. It was a Hironite, an insect-bird hybrid that nested near to dark water sources. I wasn't sure what the app was showing me juxtaposition to the GPS map, but I saw a bright red dot for the creature in question over an oversized yellow smiley face. I was nearly out of breath and drenched in sweat as I crested over a hill to a short, roundabout trail that jogged off the main path. The app told me the Hironite was appearing just on the jog. I stomped across the thicket and saw Chris. He was past a yellow plastic fence barricading an abandoned stone well. He was climbing over the stones and reaching into the well itself with his phone. I yelled out to him with my loudest voice and darted towards him at an unholy speed, despite the burn in my legs. I grabbed his ankle and pulled him as the stones of the well started to crumble into the well. I caught a glimpse of the endless darkness he had nearly fallen into, head first. It wasn't something I'd wish on my worst enemy. As I brought him to his feet, I didn't have time to scold him. My only statement to him, as he caught his breath, was from his shrill scream, was if he knew where Grace had disappeared to. As I tried to catch my own breath, he shook his head no. I swallowed hard, having next to no spit left to swallow. I asked him what monster Grace was looking for, because at the time I couldn't remember. I grabbed Chris and pulled him up to his feet as I struggled against the gravel and dirt to pull myself up. I racked my brain thinking about what Grace would be after. Then I remembered that time she stood in front of my closet in the middle of the night. She was looking for some kind of spectral creature. I set my app to search far and wide for that classic creature, and then I got a weak hit towards the abandoned mine-loading facility at the far end of the trail. I told Chris in a raspy, out-of-breath voice to follow me as I set off running in that location. It was a long slog running over the hilly, winding terrain. I reached the end of the preserve, and the opening to the rusted industrial land featured a decrepit tall building that seemed to reach over a large number of railroad tracks at the base of the hill. I saw Grace following her smartphone, skipping along the railroad tracks. I cried out to her, but my voice was either too hoarse or she was too distracted by the app to care. My legs, knees, chest, just about everything else hurt as I started my descent to get Grace. I tripped over a root in the untamed woods and fell. When I finally lifted my head up, I saw the freight train whip around the hillside at full speed. I let out a shriek for Grace, who was still following her monster on the train tracks, mere seconds ahead of the speeding locomotive. As I struggled to my feet again, Chris took off in a full run for Grace. I screamed in vain to them both as Chris crossed the multitude of tracks to Grace, who had turned and froze like a deer in the headlights to the speeding train. I lost sight of both of them as the train crossed in front of me. I was in hysterics as I figured they had both been struck. I went to my hands and feet and crawled along with the loud speeding train as I screamed in vain for both of them. The train passed in front of me for an eternity and a half. I kept yelling for them between bawling my eyes out. I came to the edge of the railroad tracks, screaming and crying as the train finally raced past and left me with open ground and track to scour for Chris and Grace's traces. "Katie!" Chris cried from the far left end of the track. I spun and saw Chris with Grace wrapped around him, about 100 feet away, past where the train had been passing. "I didn't get my mind banshee," Grace said as she released from a sobbing Chris. I picked her up out of reflex and squeezed her, with half my mind to yell at her, and the other half just to squeeze her even tighter. I held them both as we staggered home. Halfway there, all of our phones started to beep, vibrate, and flash. We pulled them out and we all saw the same message. It was from the Palm Predators app. It read succinctly in red, bloody letters against a black screen. Game over. Thanks for playing. One of us tried to cycle back through the app, but that only seemed to remove the app from our phone entirely. We couldn't find it on the App Store after that. No one could. After I got Grace and Chris home, needless to say, with no Palm Predators to play, I had a lot more time on my hands. I started doing some research into various emergency events reported on August 5th. I turned up no fewer than 256 vehicle crashes, 6 aircraft incidents, 67 confined space incidents, including 38 involving a trash compactor. Across the United States, I found 518 trespass incidents, 127 of which involved fatal electrocutions at high voltage facilities, and an additional 54 involved fatal falls. I also uncovered no fewer than 200 missing persons reports from the week and 2 weeks after the 5th, and most tellingly, 327 reported fatalities from these incidents, alongside nearly 1,000 injury reports. A good number from physical fighting, all seemingly stemming from the big one. I don't know how this incident hasn't been reported to the police. I don't know how this incident isn't in the media. I don't know how, at a minimum, somebody hasn't contacted some sort of consumer protection groups. I just know that this isn't news. But I'm determined to get a full accounting and to bring the now defunct Palm Predators app creators to justice. Otherwise, some app in the future will do just the same thing and try to cull more unsuspecting people